artificial general intelligence, AGI. It's this idea that, well, it conjures up these huge images of the future, doesn't it? Solving massive global problems, maybe changing everything we know.
Mm-hmm. And right now, one name that keeps coming up is OpenAI. They're really central to this whole story unfolding.
Yeah, they really are. But OpenAI isn't just about, the flashy AI models.
Right. Their original structure, their stated mission, that's what set them apart initially.
Mm.
And it's that foundation that's now, well, it's at the center of a pretty intense debate.
Exactly. So today we're going to dive deep into what feels like a real turning point for OpenAI.
We're looking at a proposed restructuring, and it's causing quite a stir. There are some significant concerns being raised.
Yeah, significant concerns from a really diverse group, too. We're talking legal experts, governance specialists, AI researchers themselves, people from nonprofits, even former OpenAI employees.
And for this deep dive, our main source is this really compelling open letter. It's titled, Not for Private Gain.
Not for private gain.
Okay. And it's backed by all these knowledgeable people directly challenging the direction OpenAI seems to be headed.
What makes this whole thing so fascinating, I think, is how OpenAI started. It wasn't your typical Silicon Valley setup aiming for maximum profit.
No, it was conceived very differently. A nonprofit body was in charge, overseeing a separate entity, but one where profits were capped.
The core idea right from the start was making sure AGI benefits all of humanity. That was the goal, not just making money for a few people. Okay, let's really unpack that. What was OpenAI's original, stated, charitable purpose?
You can find it right there in their Articles of Incorporation.
Wow.
Stated very clearly, their purpose is, and I'm quoting loosely here, to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity.
Benefits all of humanity.
Yes. And crucially, it adds that this is not for the private gain of any person.
Yeah.
That distinction is, well, it's fundamental. It's not just wording. It was their whole initial commitment.
So building AGI, that wasn't the end goal in itself. It was more like, the tool, a means to an end.
Precisely. It was the means to achieve this much larger goal of benefiting everyone. OpenAI's president, Greg Brockman, put it quite well.
Oh, yeah. What did he say?
He said something like, the true mission isn't for OpenAI to build AGI. The true mission is for AGI to go well for humanity. He even added, our goal isn't to be the ones to build it. Our goal is to make sure it goes well for the world.
Wow. That really puts the emphasis on the ethics, the distribution of benefits, making sure it goes well.
Exactly. That was supposed to be paramount, even more important than just, winning the race to build it first.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The founders, they were genuinely concerned about AGI development being driven solely by profit, weren't they?
Seems so. The letter we're looking at actually mentions a 2015 email from Sam Altman.
Oh, before OpenAI was even formally founded.
Right. He apparently expressed concerns about Google buying DeepMind and suggested a nonprofit model might be a better way forward.
So it paints this picture of a very conscious decision trying to avoid the potential downsides of purely commercial interests taking over something so powerful.
That's a really key point. The whole origin story seems rooted in wanting a different path for AGI.
Yeah.
One where safety and society weren't just afterthoughts to the financial bottom line.
Okay, before we go further, let's just clarify AGI itself. What's the working definition OpenAI uses, just so we're all on the same page?
Their definition is a highly autonomous system that outperforms humans at most economically valuable work.
Outperforms humans at most economically valuable work. That's quite a threshold.
It is. It's not just a slight improvement. It signifies a system with really broad capabilities, potentially exceeding human abilities in many critical areas.
And they do see incredible potential upsides if AGI is achieved responsibly, right? Like huge benefits.
Oh, absolutely. They talk about AGI driving massive abundance, huge economic growth, maybe enabling scientific discoveries we can't even imagine right now. The potential positive impact is, frankly, staggering.
But with that kind of power comes enormous risk. We hear that all the time.
Indeed. And OpenAI acknowledges this. They're very aware of the serious risks, things like misuse, potential accidents, catastrophic ones, and just profound societal disruption.
Yeah.
It's quite sobering, actually. Mr. Altman himself, along with many other big names in AI, signed that statement saying that mitigating the extinction risk from AI should be a global priority.
Right up there with pandemics and nuclear war.
Exactly. It just highlights the immense weight of responsibility here.
Puts it in perspective, definitely. And it sounds like they believe AGI might be closer than maybe a lot of us realize.
Well, recent statements from Mr. Altman do suggest a growing confidence. He's indicated they think they know how to build it now.
Really?
And he's even speculated it could happen within the current U.S. presidential term.
Wow. Okay. That definitely adds urgency to this whole debate about structure and control, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The perceived timeline likely fuels the intensity of this discussion.
So back in 2019, they tried to balance this need for, well, huge amounts of money with their mission. They set up this unusual two-part structure. Can you walk us through how that worked and what were the key protections they put in place then?
Okay, so 2019, they realized that traditional nonprofit fundraising just wasn't going to cut it for the sheer cost of AGI research.
Right. It needs massive investment.
Massive. So they did something innovative. They created a controlled for-profit subsidiary, OpenAI Profit it was called.
Okay, OpenAI Profit.
But, and this is crucial, it operated under the governance of the original nonprofit, OpenAI Nonprofit. This allowed them to bring in investment.
But they tried to keep the mission safe through specific rules, these safeguards?
Exactly. Several key governance mechanisms were built in.
All right, let's get into those. First one was nonprofit control.
Yes, nonprofit control. OpenAI was very explicit. The new for-profit company is controlled by OpenAI Nonprofit's board.
So the nonprofit board called the shots.
That was the idea. And it wasn't just on paper. Investors, employees, they apparently signed agreements legally obligating OpenAI Profit to prioritize the original charter.
Even if that meant leaving money on the table.
Potentially, yes. The mission was embedded as the primary directive.
Okay, that sounds pretty strong. What was the second safeguard?
The second was capped investor profits. This was quite clever, really.
How did that work?
Investors could get a return, obviously, to incentivize putting money in, but any profits above a certain predefined cap would flow back to the nonprofit.
Ah, so it limited the upside for investors.
Exactly. It was an attempt to square the circle, get the needed capital, but ensure that the potentially enormous value created by AGI would mostly benefit the public in the long run via the nonprofit.
Did Altman explain the thinking behind that?
Yeah, he talked about it as a way to attract talent and capital with something like startup equity, but making sure the vast majority of future wealth served humanity.
Interesting balance. Okay, so nonprofit control, capped profits. And the third element was an independent board.
Yes, an independent board structure. To minimize conflicts of interest, the rule was that only a minority of the board members could have a financial stake in the for-profit side.
Only a minority.
And critically, for decisions where investor interests and the mission might clash, things like payouts, only the board members without a financial stake could vote.
So the financially disinterested members had the final say on potential conflicts.
That was the design.
Okay, those seem like pretty solid guardrails. And the letter points out that Altman himself talked these up, right? Even in Congress in 2023.
That's a really important point the letter makes. He highlighted these very safeguards: nonprofit control, the legal duty to the mission, the independent board, profit caps, the fact that AGI Tech itself would belong to the nonprofit as proof that OpenAI was committed to its long-term mission.
So the leadership consistently pointed to this structure as the guarantee.
Yes, they presented it as the bedrock of their commitment to doing AGI development responsibly.
Which naturally makes this current proposal to change things.
Well, it makes it very concerning to the people who signed this letter. Can you outline what the new plan is? And what are the big worries?
Okay, the new proposal is essentially this. OpenAI Profit, the subsidiary, would become a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, or PBC. Let's call it OpenAI PBC.
A PBC.
This new OpenAI PBC would then basically run the operations, the business side of things.
And what happens to the original nonprofit, OpenAI Nonprofit?
The idea is that the nonprofit would shift its focus. It would pursue other broader charitable projects, maybe in healthcare, education, science, things like that.
And its ownership stake.
Its current stake in OpenAI Profit would get converted into shares in the new OpenAI PBC.
Okay, and the core concern, reading the letter, seems to be that this effectively removes the nonprofit's control. It gets rid of those safeguards we just discussed.
That's exactly the fear. The letter signatories argued this fundamentally changes the legal duties and the core incentives of the entity actually building the AGI.
They see it as shifting away from that legally enforceable duty to the public, making sure AGI is safe and beneficial for everyone towards a corporate structure where the main legal duty is to the shareholders, to their financial interests.
So potentially prioritizing profit over the public good.
That's the concern. Essentially, the worry is a shift from people first to potentially profit first.
Huh.
A fundamental change in the organization's DNA as they see it.
The letter really breaks down how this impacts each specific safeguard. Let's walk through those. First, the idea that profit motives have to be secondary to the mission. How does the PBC change that?
Well, right now, the nonprofit board has a fiduciary duty, a legal obligation to prioritize the charitable mission above everything else, even profit. And importantly, state attorneys general can enforce this.
Okay.
With the PBC, the primary duty shifts. Directors have to consider the financial interests of shareholders. Yes, a PBC has a stated public benefit, but directors don't owe the same kind of legally enforceable duty to the beneficiaries of that public benefit as a nonprofit board does.
So it weakens the legal commitment to the mission.
That's the argument. A significant weakening, potentially.
Okay. What about the second point, that legally enforceable duty to the mission currently overseen by the attorneys general in Delaware and California?
This is a huge point in the letter. Right now, those AGs act as watchdogs for the public interest. They can step in.
Right.
The proposed restructuring would essentially remove that direct public oversight of AGI development by elected officials who are accountable to voters.
So who would hold them accountable?
The main legal route would likely shift to shareholders of the PBC suing the board if they felt their profit interests weren't being adequately considered.
So the legal pressure could flip from ensuring public benefit to maximizing shareholder value.
That's the potential change in the balance of power, yes. Prioritizing shareholder interests over the broad public good in critical AGI decisions becomes a real risk.
Okay, safeguard 3, capped investor profits. What's the concern there under the restructuring?
OpenAI hasn't publicly confirmed what happens to the profit caps, but the letter highlights what they call credible reports, suggesting that recent big investments were contingent on removing those caps.
If the caps go away.
Then potentially astronomical profits from AGI, which were originally intended to flow back to the nonprofit for humanity's benefit, could instead go mostly to private shareholders.
A massive wealth transfer, essentially.
That's the fear. It would fundamentally change who benefits economically from AGI.
What about the board independence? That commitment to a majority independent board, is that safe?
Well, OpenAI hasn't publicly committed that the new PBC would be legally required to keep a majority independent board. That's one uncertainty.
And there's more.
Plus, there are these conflicting reports about whether Mr. Altman himself might get a significant equity stake in this new PBC.
Which could create a conflict of interest for him.
Exactly. If he has a large personal financial stake tied directly to the PBC's profitability, it raises questions about independence and how decisions are made.
And maybe the most crucial point, who actually owns and controls the AGI if and when it's developed?
Under the current setup, any AGI is ultimately controlled by the nonprofit, with its legal duty to benefit humanity. Their deal with Microsoft, for instance, reportedly gives Microsoft no direct rights to AGI tech.
Okay.
The strong assumption outlined in the letter is that under the new PBC structure, AGI would legally belong to OpenAI PBC and its investors.
Which means the nonprofit loses that ultimate control.
That's the profound concern. Would the nonprofit retain enough power to ensure AGI is deployed safely and broadly? The letter even mentions reports of discussions about possibly lifting the current restrictions on Microsoft's access to AGI.
Wow. Okay. And finally, the letter mentions a stop and assist commitment from the original charter. What's the worry there?
The charter includes this pledge that if another similarly mission-aligned project gets close to AGI first, OpenAI would stop competing and help them.
Okay, a cooperation clause.
Right. OpenAI hasn't said if the PBC would formally adopt this. But even if they said they would, the argument is that a for-profit PBC with duties to shareholders could much more easily justify ignoring that commitment if it hurt their bottom line.
Because the legally binding duty to the mission would be weaker.
Precisely. That underpinning is removed, or at least significantly diluted.
The letter quotes Greg Brockman from back in 2018, something about the ethical core, benefits belonging to everyone. It feels like this restructuring could really challenge that core idea.
Absolutely. The letter argues very forcefully that losing control over AGI development control that's legally tied to the public benefit mission isn't something you could just put a price tag on.
They use a pretty stark analogy, don't they?
They do. They compare it to selling control over something like the Manhattan Project. Once that control is gone, you can't really get it back, and the consequences could be immense.
Okay, so given all these concerns, what reasons has OpenAI actually given publicly for wanting this restructuring? And why does the not-for-private gain letter find those reasons unconvincing?
The main public justification seems to be about competitive advantage, needing to attract more investment, needing to attract top talent.
How so?
They argue that a more familiar corporate structure, like a PBC that can offer conventional equity, makes it easier to compete. They suggest the current capped profit model is confusing or less appealing to big investors.
But the letter pushes back hard on that.
Very hard. The signatories basically say, look, OpenAI's mission isn't maximizing profit or market share. That unique structure, even with its potential competitive costs, was the point. It was the trade-off for the mission.
They also question whether OpenAI winning the race necessarily benefits humanity anyway.
Exactly. They raise serious doubts about that link, pointing to several past actions by OpenAI that, in their view, raise safety and ethical red flags.
Right, so for the average person, for you and me, the potential downside here is an AGI future driven more by profit than by safety or broad benefit.
That's the underlying worry, yes. What kind of decisions get made when shareholder return becomes the primary legal driver?
Can you give some examples of those past actions that raised concerns? The letter mentions some.
Yeah, the letter cites things like reports of cutting back on safety testing, maybe rushing models out the door, apparently backtracking on a commitment to dedicate massive computing power specifically to safety research. Also, private lobbying against regulations, even while publicly supporting them, and even considering limiting global access to compute while seeking deals with potentially unfriendly nations.
Okay, so a pattern of actions that doesn't always seem aligned with purely benefiting humanity.
That's the picture the letter paints. It challenges the idea that just because OpenAI is winning, humanity automatically benefits.
What about the American leadership angle? OpenAI sometimes frames this as being important for the U.S. to lead in AI.
Yes, that argument comes up, the strategic importance of an American company leading AGI development, especially versus potential rivals.
And the counter-argument.
The letter says, well, if U.S. leadership is the main goal, the current nonprofit OpenAI could collaborate with or assist other aligned U.S. entities, the government, universities, etc. They even point back to that stop and assist clause in the charter.
Suggesting cooperation might be better than just competition in some scenarios.
Right. It implies the goal shouldn't just be OpenAI winning, but ensuring AGI development happens safely and beneficially, potentially through collaboration if needed.
So it feels like the core of the counter-argument is that OpenAI hasn't really made the case for why getting rid of nonprofit control is the only way to solve these challenges, like raising capital.
Exactly. The letter basically asks, why can't the current board, which already has a duty to the mission, also consider investor and employee interests, as long as it ultimately serves that mission?
The restructuring seems to flip the priority.
It appears to prioritize those financial interests over the mission, rather than alongside or in service of it. That's the core criticism.
And one last point OpenAI makes, that this change would create one of the best resource nonprofits in history. How does the letter address that?
They point out quite simply that the nonprofit already owns this massive potential wealth through its stake in OpenAI profit. The transaction is just converting that stake into shares in the new PBC.
So it's not creating new wealth for the nonprofit?
Not really. It's just changing the form of the asset. And more importantly, the letter asks, does just having a big pot of money for general charity fulfill OpenAI's very specific and critical mission related to AGI safety and benefit?
They argue the deal doesn't value the loss of control over AGI itself.
Exactly. That loss of control, which was the whole point of the original structure, isn't accounted for in the transaction's value, according to the letter.
Okay, so faced with all these concerns, the not-for-private gain letter doesn't just criticize, it proposes action. It calls on the attorneys general, Bonta and Jennings. What specific questions do they want investigated?
They lay out a pretty detailed list of questions for the AGs, grouped into a few areas. First, they want to understand the board's reasoning.
Like why this specific plan?
Exactly. What other options were considered? What changed since Altman's 2023 testimony that makes this necessary now? Are the original worries about profit incentives suddenly irrelevant? And how much did investor pressure influence this?
They also want to know about who was involved in the decision, right? Potential conflicts of interest.
Yes, the involvement of interested directors.
Yeah.
Who was in the room making the decision? Who recused themselves? What potential conflicts did they have? Crucially, could any directors personally profit from this restructuring?
And finally, they want deep scrutiny of the restructuring plan itself, the nuts and bolts.
That's right. How will the new OpenAI PBC actually be governed? What specific safeguards will remain to keep it mission-aligned? Who can hold it accountable if it causes harm? Will it formally recommit to the original charter principles?
More details needed.
Yes. And what's its stance on working with other AI groups? What exactly happens to the profit caps? And how is the value transferred to the nonprofit calculated? Who ultimately owns and controls AGI? And what rights will major investors like Microsoft have? They want clarity on all of that.
And beyond asking questions, the letter requests specific actions from the attorneys general to protect the original charitable purpose.
Yes, they make very direct requests. The main one, the most urgent, is basically, don't let this restructuring happen as proposed. Block it.
Yeah, preserve the original safeguards.
Preserve the core governance structure. The legal duty to the mission first, profit second, legally enforceable duty, keep the profit caps, keep the stop and assist commitment, and ensure the nonprofit retains ultimate ownership and control of AGI.
They also focus on the nonprofit board itself, making sure it can actually do its job going forward.
Absolutely. They stress the need for a genuinely independent board with the right resources, information access, and critically, the will to push back against management if needed to protect the mission.
How would that work in practice?
Suggestions include removing conflicted directors, guaranteeing a majority of truly independent members with relevant expertise, giving the board its own adequate staff and budget for oversight, ensuring regular, transparent updates from management, requiring prompt answers to board questions, and having ongoing oversight of these changes. Basically, empowering the board to be a real check.
Wow. This whole situation really throws a spotlight on a fundamental tension in developing powerful technologies, doesn't it?
It really does. You have this incredible drive to innovate, to unlock potential benefits.
But also this crucial need to make sure that power serves everyone, that it's guided by more than just profit.
Exactly. This OpenAI restructuring forces us to ask really hard questions about AGI's future. It highlights just how important these legal structures, these governance safeguards might be for protecting the public interest when we're dealing with technology this transformative.
So as you've been listening to our deep dive today, maybe take a moment to consider, what kind of oversight, what accountability do you think is essential as we develop technologies with this kind of world-changing and potentially world-risking power? What's the right role for nonprofit structures, for public benefit goals in these kinds of huge, high-stakes endeavors?
It's definitely something worth thinking about. The answers will shape not just AI's future, but potentially all of ours.